They offered him a job as their driver, and he already owned the company they were trying to impress. A quiet man spent 4 years watching his wife's family treat him like a charity case they'd grown tired of funding. He sat at their tables, absorbed their jokes, and said nothing while they built their empire on top of something he had created 23 years before they ever learned his name. They thought his silence was weakness. They thought his patience was limitation. They thought the most dangerous thing about him was that he might scratch their car doors. What they didn't know, and what even he didn't fully know, was that buried inside a manila folder he'd carried for 2 decades was a single clause on page 11 of a contract that made their entire world his, down to the last server, the last client, the last dollar they'd ever claimed they built from nothing. The moment they handed him those car keys was the moment they handed him everything. So what happens when the man you publicly humiliated in front of your entire family turns out to have been holding the deed to your life this whole time? If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that like button right now and make sure you subscribe so you never miss a story. And drop your city in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching from today. This community spans every time zone, and I want to hear from you. Now let me take you all the way back to a Saturday evening in uptown New Orleans, where a family was celebrating 25 years of building something they were about to discover they never fully owned. The Fontaine house sat on a corner lot in uptown New Orleans, like it had been placed there by someone who wanted the neighborhood to know exactly who lived inside. Wide porch, gas lanterns, a circular driveway that didn't need to be circular, but was anyway. Solomon Tate had parked his truck on the street. He was sitting at the far end of the dining table, the last seat before the china cabinet, nursing a glass of sweet tea that had gone warm an hour ago. Around him, the room was loud in the particular way that money and family and occasion made loud. Silverware against good plates, laughter that arrived a half-second before the joke finished, the sound of people performing their best selves for each other. The table seated 22, Solomon had counted. Bernard Fontaine stood at the head of it all. He was 67 years old and built like a man who had decided somewhere around 50 that he would never again be uncomfortable. Silver at the temples, custom suit the color of charcoal. He held his champagne glass the way a pastor holds a Bible, not for drinking, but for authority. He had been speaking for the better part of 30 minutes, and not a single person at that table had looked at their watch. 25 years ago, Bernard said, his voice dropping into the register he saved for significance, I signed one contract, one, out of a back office on Magazine Street with a second-hand fax machine and a prayer. He paused, let it land. Tonight, Fontaine Digital Partners touches $90 million in annual contracts, and we are just getting started. The table erupted, glasses rose. Solomon's brother-in-law Terence, seated 3 chairs to Bernard's left, led the applause like he was conducting it. Claudette was seated near the middle of the table between her mother and her cousin Denise. She laughed at the right moments, touched her pearls at the right moments, tilted her head toward her father with an expression that said she had been raised by this man and was proud of every inch of it. Occasionally, her eyes moved to the far end of the table, not to check on Solomon exactly. More the way you glance at a piece of furniture you aren't sure matches the room. Solomon watched his wife the way he watched most things, quietly, without broadcasting what he saw. Bernard was moving now. The toast had shifted into something longer, a laying out of the family's future, a distribution of roles and responsibilities that sounded generous and landed like a coronation. Terence would lead the Southeast expansion, Claudette would oversee brand development, Bernard's nephew would take regional sales, Each name was met with applause, with leaning in, with the warm machinery of a family that had decided what it was and intended to remain it. Then Bernard reached the end of the table. He looked at Solomon. The pause was slight, just a breath longer than it needed to be. But the table felt it and went a shade quieter. "And Solomon," Bernard said, smiling the way a man smiles when he has already decided the punchline, "we've actually been looking for someone reliable to handle client airport pickups. Morning runs mostly. You'd be perfect for it." The laughter started at Terence's end and moved down the table like a wave that knew where it was going. Someone said something to someone else. Denise pressed her lips together. Bernard lifted his glass as if the matter had been settled and returned to the room's attention. Claudette raised her champagne. She did not look at her husband. Solomon felt the laughter the way you feel weather. Present, physical, passing over him without finding purchase. He nodded once. Slow, pocketed both hands. Said nothing, because there was nothing in the room worth saying it to. What nobody at that table noticed, what nobody in that house had ever thought to notice, was the edge of a manila folder visible at the inside breast pocket of Solomon's jacket. Just the tab of it. The corner of something old and folded that he had carried for so long, it had become part of how he dressed, the way some men carry a pocket square. He had never thought to remove it. He had never thought it mattered. He had been carrying it for 23 years under the sincere belief that it was worth nothing. He drove home alone. Claudette had said she would ride with her mother, her voice bright and easy, already turning back toward the table before she finished the sentence. Solomon had nodded. He had retrieved his jacket from the coat rack near the front door, walked down the circular driveway past the cars he hadn't parked in, and gotten into his truck. The city moved past his windows in the dark, the old oaks on St. Charles, the yellow lights of the corner stores, the smell of the river underneath everything. He did not turn on the radio. He drove the way he lived, which was to say quietly and without performance, his hands steady on the wheel. The folder pressed lightly against his chest. He had carried it so long he no longer felt it. But that was about to change. To understand what that silence in the car meant, you have to go back further. You have to go all the way back to Birmingham, to a house on Ensley Avenue with a screen door that never quite closed right, to a young man sitting in a back bedroom at 2 a.m. with a second-hand computer and an idea that wouldn't let him sleep. Solomon Tate was 23 years old in the summer of 2001. He had no investors, no mentor, no network of people who owed him favors. What he had was his grandmother Lena's house, a Dell desktop he'd bought used from a coworker for $240, and a framework architecture he'd been building in his head for the better part of 2 years. He called it Tate Path. It was a routing logic system, a way of organizing how data moved through middleware infrastructure that was faster and cleaner than anything the commercial market had produced at that price point. He knew it was good. He didn't know how good. He worked nights, days. He did contract IT support for small businesses, printer jams, network resets, the kind of work that paid enough to keep the lights on and left his mind free for the real problem. He ate whatever his grandmother left covered on the stove. He drank coffee so strong it left a ring in the mug, and slowly, over 18 months of nights, Tate Path took shape in that back bedroom while the rest of the house slept. In March of 2002, a small software company called Caldwell Middleware reached out through a developer forum where Solomon had posted a technical paper. They wanted to license Tate Path. Then they wanted to buy it outright. The negotiation lasted 3 weeks and ended with a number that made Solomon sit very still at his grandmother's kitchen table For a long time, $180,000. It was more money than his grandmother had made in a decade of nursing work. It was more than Solomon had ever held a concept of in his own name. He signed the purchase agreement the same afternoon he received it, before anything in him could get nervous and talk him out of it. He read every page, or believed he had. Page 11 contained a royalty clause, standard boilerplate language about ongoing revenue participation, in the event the framework was integrated into commercial products, generating annual gross revenue above a specified threshold. Solomon read it, he understood it, and he filed it away with the sincere, reasonable belief that Caldwell Middleware was a small company in a volatile industry, and that the clause would never trigger because companies like Caldwell did not survive long enough to trigger anything. He put the signed copy in a manila folder. He put the folder in a box. He moved on. In 2004, Caldwell was acquired by a Dallas firm called Data Bridge Systems. Solomon received no notification because the acquisition legally continued all prior agreements without requiring active parties to be contacted. In 2011, Data Bridge was absorbed by North Star Systems in a transaction that made industry news for 3 weeks and was forgotten by most people outside the sector. Solomon heard the name North Star the way he heard most corporate news, distantly, as background texture, nothing to do with him. The royalty clause moved with Tate path through every acquisition, intact and active and accumulating, attached to a payment routing address that Solomon had not updated since 2019 when he and Claudette moved to New Orleans. He had no idea. He genuinely, completely had no idea. He thought the most valuable thing he had ever built had earned him $180,000 and a frame on a wall. He had printed a section of the original Tate Path code, not for show, just for himself, the way a man keeps a photograph of something that mattered, and framed it in a simple black frame the week they moved into the New Orleans house. He hung it in his home office next to the window. It was the first thing he unpacked. It was one of the last things Claudette respected about him. She had been warm when they met, 4 years ago, at a mutual friend's crawfish boil in Mid-City. Curious about him even, she liked his steadiness, she said. She liked that he didn't need a room to know he was in it. But the Fontaine family was a gravitational system, and the longer Claudette orbited it, the less she could see of anything outside its pull. Her mother, Celestine, had made her opinion known within the first month of the relationship. Not loudly. The Fontaine women didn't do anything loudly. She did it through the way she smiled at Solomon's answers to her questions about his work. That particular smile that meant she had already moved on before he finished. She did it through the compliments she gave Claudette later, when Solomon wasn't in the room, about how patient her daughter was. The marriage had been warm for about a year. Then it became a performance of warmth. Then it became something else. But Solomon had carried his grandmother's steadiness in his chest like a compass, and it had always pointed the same direction. Forward, quiet, without complaint. He believed the folder was worthless. He believed the code on his wall was nostalgia. The Fontaines had believed the same thing. Every single one of them was wrong. The certified letters were in a rubber-banded stack on the corner of his home office desk, underneath a power bill and a parts catalogue from an electronics supplier he hadn't ordered from in 2 years. Solomon found them Sunday morning, still in his dress shirt from the night before, moving through the house in the particular silence of a man who has learned not to expect company. He counted 7 envelopes, all from North Star Systems Legal Affairs Division, Houston, Texas, each one stamped with a red, urgent designation across the face. The most recent was dated 8 months prior. The oldest was dated 3 years back. He had moved and never updated his mailing address with anyone he didn't think mattered. He opened the most recent letter first, standing at his desk, one hand braced on the surface. He read it once, then again. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down. He opened the second letter, then the third. After the third, he didn't move for a long time. The room was quiet. The gospel station his grandmother used to play was drifting from somewhere 2 houses down, faint as a memory. Solomon sat with his hands flat on the desk and let the information settle through him the way cold water settles, slowly, completely, reaching every part. The letters were formal and precise. North Star Systems was attempting to fulfill its contractual obligation under a royalty agreement originally executed with Caldwell Middleware in 2002, the Tate Path framework. Payment routing had been attempted repeatedly. Funds had been transferred to Delaware's unclaimed property escrow, pending successful contact with the rights holder. The letters requested updated banking information at Solomon's earliest convenience. He reached into his jacket, which was folded over the back of the chair, and pulled out the manila folder. He opened it, flat on the desk. He had not read this document with any real attention in over 20 years. He found page 11 in under 30 seconds. The clause was there, exactly where he had left it, exactly as he had signed it. 0.003% of gross annual revenue in perpetuity, surviving any acquisition or corporate restructuring of the licensee entity. He had read these words in 2002 and thought they meant nothing because Caldwell Middleware meant nothing. He had been right about Caldwell. He had been catastrophically wrong about everything that came after it. He typed North Star Systems into his phone. $43 billion in enterprise valuation, $8.2 billion in annual gross revenue, backbone infrastructure for half of corporate America's cloud architecture, one of the 10 largest enterprise software companies in the country. Solomon set the phone down. He looked at the wall where the framed code hung in its simple black frame, the same lines he had written in his grandmother's back bedroom while the house slept around him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he got up, changed his shirt, and drove to Baton Rouge. He did not call ahead. He walked into the offices of Meridian and Cole at 11:30 on a Monday morning and told the woman at the front desk that he needed to speak with whoever handled intellectual property acquisitions. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, without drama, in a voice that expected to be taken seriously. He was shown to Patricia Osei's office within 20 minutes. Patricia was 44 years old, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a desk that held more active case files than most attorneys would admit to managing. She listened to Solomon without interrupting. She asked to see the original agreement. She read page 11 twice, then asked Solomon to excuse her for a moment, and made 2 phone calls that lasted a combined 9 minutes. When she came back, she sat down across from him and told him everything. Caldwell Middleware had been acquired by Databridge Systems in 2004. The acquisition was a full asset transfer, all contracts, all licensing agreements, all IP dependencies carried forward without modification. Databridge had been absorbed by North Star Systems in 2011 in a merger that had restructured the entire enterprise stack but left underlying IP agreements intact as a matter of contractual law. The Tate Path royalty clause had survived every transaction. It had been active and accruing since the day Solomon signed it. 0.003% of $8.2 billion was $24.6 million per year. Patricia let that number sit in the air between them. The accumulated payments, she continued, the ones that had been routing to a wrong address and transferring into Delaware's unclaimed property escrow, totaled $187 million. Recoverable. All of it. Solomon's updated address was the only thing standing between him and that number. Solomon was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her to walk him through the recovery process. Patricia turned to her screen and began pulling up supporting documentation. North Star's current enterprise client registry, the Tate Path licensing dependency chain, the escrow filing records. She was explaining the chain of title structure when she scrolled past a client list and gestured at it generally to illustrate a point about how broadly Tate Path had been integrated. Solomon saw a name on that list, Fontaine Digital Partners, New Orleans, Louisiana, active enterprise license, Tate Path dependent stack. He went very still. Patricia kept talking. She didn't notice. Solomon waited until she finished her sentence. Then he asked her one question. He said, "What happens to a company that's built on licensed Tate Path software if the IP chain of title comes into dispute?" Patricia Osei took off her reading glasses. She looked at him with the careful attention of someone who has just understood that the conversation has changed. Then she told him exactly what would happen. And Solomon listened to every word. Patricia gave Solomon 3 options. The first was loud. A public filing asserting full IP rights, immediately triggering litigation that would make the business press within a week. The second was moderate, a direct negotiation with North Star to formalize his royalty position without involving enterprise clients at all. The third was surgical. No press, no announcements, no aggression of any visible kind. Just clean, sequential legal mechanics executed in the correct order, each one triggering the next by the force of its own procedural weight. Solomon chose the third option without hesitating. He told Patricia he wasn't interested in making noise. He was interested in making it permanent. She nodded once, pulled a fresh legal pad from her drawer, and they got to work. The first step was the Delaware escrow recovery filing. This was, on its surface, a simple administrative action, a rights holder submitting updated contact and banking information to claim accumulated unclaimed property. Routine, invisible. But Patricia explained that the filing would trigger something important on North Star's end. As a matter of standard corporate procedure, any active, unclaimed property claim tied to an IP agreement required North Star's legal department to conduct an internal audit of that agreement's current status. That audit would in turn surface every enterprise client whose software stack carried a Tate Path dependency, including Fontaine Digital Partners. The filing would be submitted under Tate Legacy LLC, a private holding entity Patricia would help Solomon establish before the first document was signed. The name on the filing would not be Solomon Tate. It would be a company name. Clean, anonymous, impossible to trace without deliberate investigation. Step 2 was the payment routing update. Once the escrow filing was processed, Solomon's banking information would be registered and the first annual distribution would activate $24.6 million routing into Tate Legacy LLC's account. Solomon would never see that money in any account connected to his personal name. It would sit in the entity, quiet and patient, exactly the way Solomon himself had always sat. Step 3 was the one with teeth. Patricia would send a formal notification to North Star's legal department, standard professional language, no inflammatory framing, advising that the Tate Path royalty chain contained unresolved chain of title complexity requiring review. This notification, once received, obligated North Star as a matter of enterprise compliance to inform all clients operating Tate Path-dependent software that a chain of title review was active. North Star would send those notices automatically. North Star's own legal obligation would do the work. Fontaine Digital would receive a notice in the mail. Not from Solomon, not from Patricia, from North Star Systems itself. Solomon drove home that evening and made red beans and rice from scratch, the kind his grandmother used to make on Mondays. The andouille simmered slow, the trinity of onion and celery and bell pepper going soft in the pan before anything else touched it. Claudette came home 2 hours later, set her bag on the counter, said she was tired, and went upstairs. She didn't ask how his day was. He didn't offer. Over the following 2 weeks, Solomon lived exactly as he had always lived. He rose early. He made his coffee. He watched the morning news. 3 afternoons a week he drove to Baton Rouge to sit with Patricia and sign documents and review filings in the careful, unhurried manner of a man who understood that precision mattered more than speed. The other afternoons he spent at home, working on a new batch of his hot sauce, testing a smoked pepper mash he'd been developing for 6 months, labeling bottles in his neat block handwriting at the kitchen table. Claudette noticed nothing different because nothing visible was different. That was the point. The night before Patricia submitted the Delaware escrow filing, Solomon sat in his home office for a long time. The room was dark except for the desk lamp. The house was quiet. Claudette had gone to bed early after a Fontaine digital strategy call that had apparently run long. He'd heard her voice through the ceiling, clipped and professional, the voice she used when she was performing competence for her father's benefit. He looked at the framed code on the wall. Just lines. Dense and dry, and written by a 23-year-old in a back bedroom in Birmingham who hadn't slept properly in a year and a half. He had printed it out and framed it because it was the first real thing he had ever made entirely on his own, and he had wanted to remember what that felt like. Claudette had called it embarrassing. Her mother had looked at it the way you look at a child's drawing hung on a refrigerator, with the particular, patient condescension of someone who considers themselves too evolved for sentiment. Solomon looked at it for a long time. Then he allowed himself one small, private smile, just one. He printed the final cover letter, folded it into the envelope Patricia had pre-addressed, sealed it, and carried it to the kitchen counter. He set it next to his keys so he wouldn't forget it in the morning. Then he turned off the lights and went to bed. He slept better than he had in 4 years. The envelope went into the mail the next morning, and on a Tuesday, 11 days later, Fontaine Digital Partners opened their email. The email arrived at Fontaine Digital Partners on a Tuesday morning at 8:47. Bernard was already at his desk when his assistant forwarded it. The subject line read, North Star Systems, Enterprise Client Notice, Tate Path IP Review, Action may be required. Bernard read it once, decided it was vendor bureaucracy, and told his assistant to file it for the legal team to review when they had a moment. He had a 9 o'clock call with a prospective client. He didn't think about the email again. That was day 1. Day 3, the hospital called. Magnolia Regional Health Network. $22 million in annual contracts, Fontaine Digital's largest and most prestigious client, had received its own notice from North Star. Their internal legal team had reviewed it overnight and arrived at a conclusion. Bernard's attorney would spend the next week trying to reverse. Until the Tate Path YP chain of title issue was formally resolved, Magnolia Regional could not in good conscience continue processing payments against software infrastructure with an unresolved ownership dispute. Payment paused. Cure notice issued. 30 days to resolve. Bernard read the notice standing in his office doorway. He called his attorney before he reached his desk. Day 5, Bernard's attorney contacted North Star directly. North Star's legal department was courteous, professional, and completely immovable. The IP review was active. All inquiries regarding the Tate Path royalty chain were being handled exclusively by outside counsel. They provided a name and a number, Meridian and Cole, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Contact Patricia Osei. Bernard's attorney made the call that afternoon. Patricia received it, reviewed the inquiry, and scheduled a formal response for the following day, day 6. Patricia's letter arrived at Bernard's attorney's office by 9 in the morning. It was 4 paragraphs long and written in the clean, bloodless language of someone who did not need to raise her voice to be devastating. The Tate Path royalty agreement, surviving through 3 corporate acquisitions, entitled the current rights holder to perpetual licensing participation. The rights holder, Tate Legacy, LLC, was initiating a formal review of all current Tate Path enterprise licensing terms. Existing licensing rates could not be considered binding pending resolution of the chain of title audit. Renegotiation would proceed at current fair market rates. The new rate represented a 340% increase over what Fontaine Digital was currently paying. Bernard's attorney called him immediately. Bernard sat down. Day 7 he called an emergency board meeting, 8 people in the conference room, Bernard at the head of the table, his face the particular color of a man who has not slept. Terence across from him, laptop open, running a public record search on Tate Legacy LLC in real time while Bernard spoke. Terence found the Delaware escrow filing first, then the North Star IP audit flag, then the entity registration, Tate Legacy LLC, registered in Louisiana, filed by Meridian and Cole on behalf of an undisclosed principal. Terence stared at the name. Tate. He looked up at Bernard. Bernard looked back at him. Neither of them said it out loud in the room, but they both felt the floor shift beneath them like something fundamental had cracked. Day 8, a reporter from a New Orleans business journal sent an inquiry to Bernard's corporate email. They had found the Delaware escrow filing in public records. They had found the North Star audit flag. They had found Tate Legacy LLC and connected it to the chain of title dispute. They were preparing a story on the IP disruption affecting Fontaine Digital's largest contracts and wanted a comment before publication. Bernard stared at the email for a long time. He did not respond. Day 9, Claudette called Solomon from her car. Her voice was tight, not quite angry, not quite frightened, landing somewhere between the two that came from trying to control both at once. She asked him, very carefully, whether he knew anything about a company called Tate Legacy. She said it had come up in a situation that was affecting her family's business. She said some people thought the name might be connected to him. Solomon listened to all of it. Then he told her they should talk in person. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said fine. He heard it in her voice, that she already knew or suspected enough that she wasn't sure she wanted to. He said nothing else. He let her hang up first. He was in the kitchen when the call ended, stirring a pot of soup he'd put on before she called. He turned the heat down, set the spoon on the rest, and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the yard. Then he went back to stirring. "Day 11, Bernard called. His voice had a quality Solomon had never heard from him before, not quite desperate, but stripped of its usual architecture. Bernard said there was a vendor situation that had gotten complicated. He said he was reaching out to people he trusted who might have contacts in the legal or corporate space. He said he knew Solomon had worked in tech. He asked if Solomon knew anyone who might be able to help resolve a dispute with a company called Tate Legacy LLC. Solomon listened to the entire thing. Then he said, "I can come by the house Friday evening, Bernard. I think this is a conversation we need to have in person." Bernard said that would be fine. He sounded relieved. He had no idea what Friday was going to cost him. For Bernard, that week moved like wet concrete, slow and heavy and impossible to get out of. For Solomon, it moved like water, downhill. Friday came. Solomon arrived at the Fontaine house at 7 in the evening with the manila folder under his arm and nothing else. No attorney, no witness, no recording device. He had told Patricia he wanted to do this part alone, and she had looked at him across her desk for a moment before nodding. She understood. This wasn't a legal proceeding. This was something else entirely. The circular driveway was lit by the gas lanterns. Solomon parked on the street, the same as always, and walked up to the front door. Bernard answered it himself. That was the first sign that something in the house had already shifted. In 4 years of visits, Solomon had never seen Bernard Fontaine open his own front door. He led Solomon to the study. Terence was already there, standing near the window with his arms crossed in the posture of a man, pretending to be calmer than he was. Claudette sat in one of the chairs along the wall, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the careful blankness she had learned from her mother. The room smelled like leather and old wood and the faint trace of Bernard's cologne, the expensive kind that arrived in a heavy bottle and announced itself before he did. Bernard gestured to a chair across from his desk. Solomon sat. He set the manila folder on the edge of the desk, but did not open it yet. Bernard began the way he began everything, from a position of assumed authority. He talked about the vendor situation. He talked about the disruption to Fontaine Digital's operations. He used the phrase, "whoever is behind this," twice in the first 2 minutes, and the third time he said it, Solomon picked up the manila folder and laid the original 2001 Caldwell Middleware purchase agreement on Bernard's desk, open to page 11. He said, "Take your time." Bernard looked down. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has stopped breathing at the same time. Bernard read slowly. Then he read it again. His expression didn't collapse all at once. It eroded like something solid meeting water, the certainty draining out of his face in stages until what was left underneath was something older and smaller and afraid. Terence pushed off the wall and came to look over Bernard's shoulder. When he saw Tate Legacy LLC in the entity registration line, his jaw tightened so hard that Solomon could see the muscle move from across the desk. Claudette didn't move, but something shifted behind her eyes. Solomon gave them time. He was not in a hurry. He had been patient for 22 years without knowing what he was being patient for. He could afford another few minutes now. Then he began to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform emotion he did not feel. He laid it out the way a man lays tile, flat, level, one piece after another, each one fitting exactly where it was supposed to go. He told them about Tate Path. He told them about the 18 months in his grandmother's back bedroom. He told them about Caldwell Middleware and the $180,000 and page 11 of the agreement they had just read. He told them about Data Bridge and North Star and the royalty clause that had survived every acquisition intact. He told them about the $24.6 million generated annually and the $187 million sitting in Delaware escrow with no place to go because he had moved and never updated his address. Then he told them about Fontaine Digital's enterprise license. He watched Bernard's face as the dependency registered. Watched the man who had built his entire identity around being a builder understand in real time that the architecture of his life's work had been resting on a foundation he had never seen and never paid for at its true price. Bernard opened his mouth. Solomon let him. Then Solomon turned to Terence. He said that the driver suggestion had been Terence's idea. He said he knew that because that was how Terence operated. He put the knife in someone else's hand and called it a gift. He said he wanted Terence to know that he had remembered every smirk, every sidebar, every moment Terence had used his sister as a vehicle for contempt. He was too careful to deliver directly. He said all of that quietly, without malice, the way you state coordinates. Then he turned to Claudette. He told her that he remembered the anniversary dinner. He told her that he had watched her raise her champagne glass and that he had noted very clearly what she had chosen in that moment. He told her that what she had chosen was consistent with a pattern he had watched develop over 4 years, and that he had no anger about it because anger required surprise, and he had not been surprised. He looked at all 3 of them, and then he said, "You spent 4 years treating me like a man who couldn't find his own purpose. But what you didn't know was that every client you ever impressed, every contract you ever signed, every dollar you ever claimed you built from nothing, it was all running on something I wrote alone in my grandmother's house before you knew my name." Bernard said they could work something out. He said there had to be a way to structure a reasonable licensing arrangement. His voice had the quality of a man bargaining with weather. Solomon told him that all further communication would go through Patricia Osei at Meridian and Cole. Then he stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the manila folder from the desk and tucked it back under his arm. Claudette said nothing. Solomon noted quietly and without surprise that this was consistent. He walked out of the study, through the wide front hallway, and out the front door without looking back. He walked down the driveway, past the gas lanterns, and got into his truck. He sat there for 60 seconds, not from hesitation, not from doubt. He sat there because he wanted to feel it, the full weight of what had just happened in that room, and then release it completely before he turned the key. He turned north, toward Birmingham. The consequences Bernard couldn't stop on Friday arrived in full on Monday. And by the time 6 months had passed, there was very little left of what the Fontaine family had spent 25 years building. Magnolia Regional Health Network did not renew. Their legal team had reviewed the IP situation thoroughly and concluded that the risk exposure was not compatible with their obligations to the hospital system's board. They sent a formal termination notice on a Wednesday morning. $22 million in annual contracts, gone in 4 paragraphs of careful legal language. 2 more clients followed within the month. Neither departure was loud. There were no dramatic announcements, no public accusations. The clients simply exercised their right to exit under the IP uncertainty clause that Northstar's compliance notice had effectively activated. Fontaine Digital's revenue, which had stood at $90 million the night Bernard made his toast, dropped to less than half that figure in a single quarter. The 340% licensing increase made recovery mathematically impossible. Bernard's accountants told him the margin model was non-viable. He had known it already, the way you know something, before you let yourself say it out loud. He began liquidating. The Uptown estate went to market at $3.1 million and sat there for 8 weeks before selling below our ask to a buyer who had no idea whose house it was or what had happened inside it. Terence left the company in March. He took a regional sales position with a technology firm in Houston, a competitor, which was noted without comment in a brief item published by the New Orleans Business Chronicle. The same paper that had been asking Bernard for comment 2 months earlier ran a 4-paragraph story on Fontaine Digital's contraction. They described it as a significant reversal for one of the region's most prominent tech consulting firms. They were understating it. Claudette filed for divorce in April. Her attorney had reviewed the IP agreement thoroughly before she filed. Solomon's royalty rights had been established in 2002, a full 2 decades before the marriage. They were premarital intellectual property held in a private LLC. Claudette was entitled to what the marriage had legally produced. The marriage had produced very little that was hers. She received what the law allowed, and nothing more. And the law, in this case, was not generous. Solomon did not contest anything. He did not complicate the process. He signed what needed signing and let Patricia handle the rest. He had already turned his attention north. The house on Ensley Avenue in Birmingham had passed to a cousin after Lena's death and had not been properly maintained in the years since. The roof had soft spots. The screen door that had never quite closed right had finally given up entirely. The back bedroom, the one with the second-hand dell, the one where Tate Path had been written in the slow hours between midnight and morning, had water damage along the base of one wall. Solomon bought the house from his cousin for a fair price without negotiation, because the point was not the transaction. He spent 4 months restoring it. He hired local contractors from the neighborhood, men who knew the house's history because they knew the street, who remembered Lena from church. He was present for every phase of the work, not supervising from a distance, but present, walking the rooms, making decisions, carrying things when his hands were useful. He kept the back bedroom intact. He repaired the wall. He refinished the floor. He left the room exactly as it had been because some rooms deserved to remain what they were. Tate Legacy LLC announced a $4 million scholarship endowment in October, established in the name of Lena Grace Tate, designated for students in STEM fields at, historically, black colleges and universities. Patricia issued the press release. It was picked up by 3 outlets before Solomon had finished his morning coffee. He read the coverage once, set his phone down, and went back to his hot sauce. The small batch retail line had launched quietly through a specialty grocer in Birmingham and a farmer's market he'd been attending since the spring. The smoked pepper mash he'd been developing for 6 months turned out to be exactly as good as he'd suspected. He labeled every bottle by hand in his kitchen on Sunday mornings while the gospel station played from the old radio his grandmother had kept on the counter. He drove the same truck. On a Saturday in November, at the farmer's market 2 blocks from Lena's restored house, Solomon was at his table arranging jars when a woman stopped to read his label. She was tall, unhurried, wearing work boots with the laces done properly, the kind of detail that said she was someone who paid attention to things. Her name was Renata. She was a structural engineer, she said, when he asked. She said she'd grown up in Birmingham and was back after years in Atlanta because she wanted to be somewhere that meant something to her. They talked for 20 minutes about peppers and structural load-bearing and the particular quality of light in Birmingham in November. She bought 2 jars. Before she left, she said the label was good work. He said thank you, and he meant it simply. He watched her walk away and felt something he had almost forgotten was available to him, the uncomplicated ease of being seen by someone who had no agenda about what they found. There is a thing that happens when a person of real substance is mistaken for a long time for a person of none. The people who make that mistake believe the silence is emptiness. They believe the patience is passivity. They believe that a man who doesn't need a room to know he is in it must not matter. What they cannot account for is that some people are not building toward a moment. They simply are who they are, fully at all times, and the moment finds them. Solomon Tate was never waiting to become someone. He was always already that person. The Fontaines were the only ones who didn't know it. And the last thing Solomon did before the renovation was complete was take the framed code down from the wall of his New Orleans office and carry it back to Birmingham in the passenger seat of his truck. He rehung it in the back bedroom of Lena's house. Same black frame, same wall. The same lines of a framework written by a 23-year-old with no network, no funding, and no one telling him his work would last. It had lasted. Now I want to ask you something before you go. If you had been Solomon sitting at that table while the room laughed, knowing nothing about what you were carrying in that folder, not yet, what would you have done? Would you have walked away sooner? Would you have fought back differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because this community always has something worth hearing. If this story moved you, please hit that like button right now. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one, and every one of those people deserves to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it today, because we have more stories coming and you do not want to miss what's next. I will see you in the next one.